Hi, I'm Dana Goswick from the University of Melbourne. I'm pleased to participate in this video project of the Social Ontology Research Group and thank Rachel Mellon and Miguel Garcia for inviting me to contribute. Today, I'll be talking about social constructionism. Before we can say anything about what social constructionism is, we first have to say what it is to be social and what it is to be constructed. What is the social? What sorts of entities, events, and facts are social? The term social means different things in different places. The obvious place to start, for the purposes of this video series, is with the introductory video Brian Epstein made, where he discusses what social ontology is. I was particularly drawn to two comments Epstein made. One, in social ontology, we want to learn the lessons of classic metaphysics, but also say that most of the world is social, or socially constructed, or the product of people and history. Two, with social ontology, the hope is to understand the social world, both in all its particulars and in the general ways it's built. So, for a sort of first pass of understanding what social ontology is and how it differs from ontology, we might say social ontology is the study of what we might say ontology is the study of what exists. Social ontology is the study of existing social things. So metaphysics and ontology have developed a lot over the last 100 years. And in particular, they've developed a sort of set of very sort of specific tools, particularly with developments in logic or 21st century developments in grounding, various tools that help us think and reason very precisely. So we might see social ontologists as using the precision tools developed by metaphysics, and then applying them to questions metaphysics traditionally hasn't addressed. Whereas the ontologist asks about numbers, properties, physical objects, and the sorts of things natural scientists study. The social ontologist asks about race, gender, groups, and the sorts of things social scientists study. We could understand the distinction between ontology and social ontology in that way. One worry I have about this and about sort of social ontology and social constructivism in general is, does a distinction between the natural world and the social world even make sense? Think of Hilary Putnam's claim, the mind and the world jointly make up the mind and the world. Maybe everything is natural, right? So not only rocks and trees and waterfalls, but also race and money and social groups. They're all natural. Or maybe on the other hand, everything is social. So not just gender and race and money and social groups, but also rocks, waterfalls, and trees. Or maybe there's no distinction between natural and social. Maybe these are just terms we use that don't actually track anything in the world. Or maybe there is a distinction between the natural and the social, but the terms are coextensive. So they might mean different things, but as a matter of fact, in the world we inhabit, everything is sort of simultaneously both natural and social. So I don't think, if we're trying to understand what social constructionism is, kind of step one is figuring out what social is and what constructionism is. And it's not so easy what to say what the social is and how it's distinct from the natural. As a heuristic marker, I think the term social, as used in social ontology and social construction, is a really useful term. But I also think it carries with it a lot of assumptions that we need to be explicit about, and that it feeds into a distinction between the social world and the natural world, which I'm not so sure we should buy into. I'll return to these worries about social at the end of the talk. Now, I'll move on to what I take to be an easier task, saying what constructionism is. Constructionism is, roughly, the view that some existing entities are, in some substantive way, dependent on us, and the way they depend on us can appropriately be called constructing, building, and other terms of that ilk. More precisely, we can say constructionism is a three-place relation. X constructs Y out of Z, which involves a constructor, X, a constructed entity, Y, a more basic entity, Z, which serves as a building block for the constructed entity. So if you want to understand what constructionism is, a good way to do it is to sort of ask three questions. Who does the constructing? What is constructed? And what is the constructed out of? So you sort of think of it as a three-place relation, C, X, Y, Z, where the construction relation holds between X and YZ when X builds Y out of Z. Constructionism is very general. It's a very general relation, C, X, Y, Z. Sort of you can plug in different things for X, Y, and Z and get very different versions of constructionism, depending on who does the constructing. Is it all humans, an ideal subject, certain groups? What is constructed? Is it a work of fiction that's constructed, a family, numbers, the whole world? And what are the constructed entities constructed out of? Atoms, collective intentionality, language, quantum fields. And so obviously someone who says an ideal subject does the constructing of the whole world out of atoms. That's going to have a very different sort of constructionism than is somebody who says a specific human constructed this work of fiction out of language, right? And we might be very happy to accept the former, but hesitant to accept the latter. So keep in mind, we can usefully say things about constructionism, but it is a very general view. And for most people, there's going to be some views of constructionism, which they're happy to embrace and which strike them as quite intuitive, and other versions of constructionism, which they think, no, that's definitely not constructed, or that wasn't constructed by so-and-so, or that wasn't constructed out of blah, blah. So general view. Despite the fact that constructionism is a fairly general view, there are certain things that unite all constructionists. In particular, constructionists are united in their opposition to certain forms of realism, namely those forms of realism that claim that X exists and is suitably independent of us. Constructionists about X agree with realists that X exists, but they deny that X is suitably independent of us. So constructionism is distinguished from realism in that realists accept and constructionists deny that X is suitably independent of us. Constructionism is distinguished from all other versions of anti-realism, right? Because there's lots of versions of anti-realism where they sort of deny the independence of X. What's distinctive about constructionism and distinguishes it from other versions of anti-realism is the emphasis constructionism places on the constructing relation, on sort of actively talking about this is constructed out of this by this person or this object or this thing. So that's the kind of canonical way of understanding constructionism. One very brief point to raise is to ask the question, does constructionism have to be anti-realist? This, of course, will depend on what we mean by constructionism and what we mean by realism. The sort of canonical way of understanding constructionism and realism has constructionism as being the denial of realism. But perhaps not, right? Perhaps there are ways we can modify slightly what we mean by realism or modify slightly what we mean by constructionism, such that they're not opposed. Okay, so just to briefly recap, constructionism is roughly the view that some existing entities are, in some substantive way, dependent on us. And the way they depend on us can appropriately be called constructing or building. So at this point in the talk, I want to raise a worry I have about social constructionism and say why, despite this worry, I think it's a very promising area of research. The worry is there really some part of reality that is distinctively social? And if so, how is it demarcated from the bits of reality that are non-social? Call this the demarcation problem for social ontology, right? And if you sort of cast your mind back to early 20th century philosophy of science, you'll think of Karl Popper, and he sort of famously discussed the demarcation problem for science, which was the problem of how do we distinguish science from non-science? What is the sort of subject matter and methodology that's distinctive of science? And I think we can analogously ask a question about social ontology. You know, how do we demarcate social ontology from natural ontology? What's the distinctive subject matter or methodology in virtue of which something is a social ontology? The whole idea of social constructionism and of social ontology in general rests on a distinction between the social and the natural. What distinguishes social ontology from natural ontology is either the target or the view. So one way we can distinguish sort of what social ontology is up to and how it's different from natural ontology is by talking about the target of inquiry. So if the target of inquiry is social, one is doing social ontology, otherwise one is doing natural ontology. So we might say races and groups are over here on the social side, rocks and numbers are over here on the natural side. So anyone who studies races and groups, in virtue of the fact that these are social entities, is doing social ontology. Whereas anyone who studies rocks and numbers, in virtue of the fact that these are natural objects, that person is doing natural ontology. That's one way we could distinguish social ontology from natural ontology. Another way we could distinguish social ontology from natural ontology is not about the sort of target of the inquiry, what you're studying, but rather the view you give of what you're studying. So we might say one is doing social ontology if one takes X to be a social entity, one gives a social account of X, whereas one is doing natural ontology if one takes X to be a natural entity, gives a natural account of X. So it might be that Jose and Jane are both studying race, groups, rocks, and numbers. And let's say Jose gives a social account of them and thereby counts as doing social ontology, whereas Jane gives a natural account of them and thereby counts as doing natural ontology. So even though they have the same target here, because they defend different views of the target, one counts as doing social ontology, one counts as doing natural ontology. So sort of either of those ways of understanding what distinguishes social ontology from natural ontology sort of presuppose that we have some grasp on sort of how the social differs from the natural. And we can sort of take this grasp, we can take our way of demarcating the social and the natural to be lightweight or heavyweight. Let me say a little bit about what it means to sort of take this distinction to be lightweight and what it means to take it to be heavyweight. So, given lightweight demarcating, there's no deep, objective, fundamental difference between social ontology and natural ontology. Given the actual sociological history of philosophy, philosophers have focused on the existence of X, Y, and Z. Social ontologists are pointing out it's philosophically useful to also focus on the existence of A, B, C. There's no sort of deep, objective, fundamental difference between entities X, Y, Z and entities A, B, C. It's just a historical accident that philosophers studied the objects they did. Likewise, there's no deep, objective, fundamental difference between social constructionism and natural constructionism. Hydrogen and oxygen atoms construct water molecules. Bees following pattern P construct a hive. Humans construct race, causation, and groups. Natural scientists and the natural philosophers inspired by them tend to focus more on the first two examples of constructing. Social scientists and the social philosophers inspired by them tend to focus more on the latter example. But this is just a historical accident. Constructionism is constructionism, regardless of how the constructing is done, and regardless of whether the constructed entity is classified as social or natural. On the other hand, given a heavyweight demarcation between the social and the natural, there's a deep, objective, fundamental difference between the natural and the social. Social ontology isn't merely an extension of natural ontology. There are distinctively social entities, events, and facts, and this is the domain of social ontology. Likewise, there is a distinctively social method of constructionism, and it's this distinctively social constructing that social ontologists are interested in. So, should we be heavyweight or lightweight about demarcating the social from the non-social natural? Given a lightweight reading of the distinction between natural and social, there's clearly an epistemically tractable difference between the social and the natural. There are groups of views which cluster most naturally around social ontology, and there are lots of useful insights we can learn from focusing on social ontology and the social sciences more generally. So, even given lightweight demarcating, social ontology is fruitful. But many philosophers interested in social ontology, both those who accept it and those who reject it, take the distinction between the social and the non-social to be heavyweight rather than lightweight. A lot more philosophical work needs to be done before we accept that there is such a heavyweight distinction. So let me say a little bit more about that. The distinction between the social and the natural that we so readily draw today wasn't always recognized. Hilary Putnam traces its importance in philosophy to Galileo and Locke's distinction between primary qualities, the ones that are really out there in the world, independent of humans, the natural ones, and secondary qualities, the ones that are partly in here, in how humans see the world, the social ones. According to Putnam, philosophy responded to the ascendancy of science in the 16th and 17th century by distinguishing the primary and secondary qualities and endorsing realism about the former and anti-realism about the latter. More generally, philosophers became realists about the natural and anti-realists about the social. And typically, it was realist, entities, events, and facts which the philosophers were interested in. Putnam himself thinks that drawing a distinction between the social and the natural is the wrong move to make, and that rather than saving realism, Galileo and Locke set philosophy on a path which would destroy realism. Whether you agree with him or not, Putnam provides a nifty sociological explanation of why traditional ontologists often neglected the questions social ontologists today are interested in, and of why 20th century metaphysics, which was largely realist in orientation, was often hostile to anything involving the social. Embracing a heavyweight understanding of social constructionism, as distinct from natural constructionism, buys into the distinction between the social and the natural, which Putnam says we should reject. Maybe that's okay, right? Maybe Putnam's worries about demarcating the social from the natural are not sort of that worrisome, or maybe it isn't okay. Maybe we should sort of look more closely into the sort of concerns Putnam raised and be a bit hesitant to sort of quite quickly distinguish the social from the natural. Social ontology is radical and brings a much needed breath of fresh air to traditional metaphysics. But social ontology is not as radical as it could be. It buys into the framework of traditional metaphysics by embracing a distinction between the natural and the social, and then goes on to say things about the social that traditional metaphysics either neglected or denied. An even more radical move would be to follow Putnam and deny this entire framework. There's no deep distinction between the natural and the social. The mind and the world jointly make up the mind and the world. And trying to separate the natural social tells us less about reality than does abandoning this distinction. There's a lot of metametaphysical presuppositions to be defended before we're in a place to give a full definition of social constructionism. We have a definition of constructionism, which we interpret in certain ways. And this allows us to somewhat sloppily, heuristically divide the socially constructed from that which is not socially constructed. Doing so is often informative and enlightening, and can remain so, even if the distinction between the social and the natural isn't deep, objective, or fundamental. Social constructionism, and the larger field of social ontology, which it's a part of, is a very promising area of research, insofar as it gives us new and interesting first-order theories, theories about race, gender, money, works of art, and so forth. Even more exciting, to me at least, is the possibilities within metametaphysics which social ontology raises. As Epstein mentioned in his talk, social ontology is a relatively new subdiscipline within philosophy, having become a central area of research only within the last 20 years or so. And the first order views of a field are typically developed before the second order views are. There is fruitful work to be done within the metametaphysics of social ontology on, for instance, how to demarcate the social from the natural, whether this demarcation is lightweight or heavyweight, whether there really is even such a distinction. And as this work advances, we'll have a better idea of whether we should embrace a distinctively social constructionism, or whether the sort of constructing studied within social ontology is a general phenomenon which occurs throughout a natural social world. So what's the sort of take-home message of this talk? Sort of first take-home message, social construction can be understood as the view that, one, some existing entities, events, and facts depend in some substantive way on us, and two, the way they depend on us can appropriately be called constructing or building, and something about this process is, in some ways yet to be fully understood, distinctively social. If we take the distinction between the social and the natural to be lightweight, We can go on doing our first order views in social ontology and using social constructionism. And we don't have to worry about the meta-metaphysics which underlies it. We can focus solely on the first order views. If, on the other hand, we take the distinction between the social and the natural to be heavyweight, then our first order views presuppose the truth of certain, as yet undefended meta-metaphysical claims, and we should be devoting some of our energy to defending these underlying meta-metaphysical claims. Thank you for listening, and I hope you will enjoy the social ontology video series as much as I have been.